How's it going, everyone? Welcome to this week's Q&A video. So like any other week, if you want a chance at one of your questions being answered, make sure you drop a comment down below and I'll do my best to get to every question. So let's go ahead and get started with the first question of the week. And it is, what procedure do I personally use to either do a brake fluid flush or the brake system flush after replacing a component? So regardless of what procedure I do after replacing that component, or if I'm doing a brake fluid flush, I typically empty out the reservoir and put fresh fluid right off the rip, just so I don't have to go through that whole reservoir of fluid through each individual caliper. So like this, you speed up the process a little bit. If it's extremely dirty, I'll bleed it out, and then I will top it off with some fluid, mix it up a little bit, and then bleed it out again, and then top off again, and then begin my brake fluid procedure. Now, typically, if I replace a component, I'll gravity bleed either that one caliper, or if it's an ABS modulator, at that point, I'll gravity bleed all four wheels, and then I'll begin my brake bleeding process, which I use my vacuum bleeder to do just to make sure I don't tie up anybody else. Sometimes you do need a manual bleed. I'll have somebody go on there and just pump the brakes and do it old school style. I don't use the procedure where you pressurize the master cylinder or anything along those lines. Some people use that, and that's fine. I just don't use that certain way to do it. So if you do choose to do it that way, that's fine. But I personally use the vacuum bleeder. I love using it, and I usually get great results out of it. I also start off by bleeding the furthest brake bleeder, so right rear, right front, left front, and that's the way I do it. And like I said, I always have success with that. Now, if I'm doing just one component, then I just bleed that one certain component. So if it would be the left rear caliper, that's what I would do. And you never really need to touch any of the other calipers, unless if you upsold a brake fluid flush at that point, then I would obviously do all four corners. After, once again, taking everything out of the reservoir and topping off with fresh brake fluid, so you're just not spending extra time, bleeding all that old fluid out. It just makes it that much quicker and just makes sense in my opinion. So hopefully that answers the question for you. Okay, so question number 2 is, how do I address plastic rattles? This was specific to the rear deck lid, I believe, but this will apply to anything. So obviously, in certain conditions with vibrations from the engine or certain roads or whatever the case may be, you're going to get excessive vibrations, and a lot of times they are from plastics rubbing on each other. And 99 out of 100 times, I'm going to use felt to kind of isolate or keep the two plastics from rattling together. They sell, different depths or different thicknesses of felt or foam tape, and that's how we usually address that. Now, sometimes if there's like a little piece that's extra, and I could clip it without obviously causing a cover to pop off, or obviously the customer not seeing a visual issue, then I'll do that if needed as well. It really depends on the rattle, but felt tape or foam tape definitely goes a long way. And of course, sometimes just like a little extra plastic from manufacturing that, once again, I will trim or reshape or try, whatever the case may be, to really just keep the plastics from rattling one another. So if you do have a rattle and you're trying to chase it, then obviously I would recommend some felt tape. Depending on the thickness, you could either do a couple layers of it, or choose different thickness, or tape with some insulation or some foam of that nature. So hopefully that answers the question for you. All right, so the next question is, what tires do I recommend versus what do I recommend staying away from? I'm a big fan of Hankooks. They're overall affordable and they perform very well, in my opinion. They're even offered on some cars as an OEM option. Now, again, I like the Hankooks. Now, obviously, Michelin's, some Contis, and Goodyears are also good tires. And there's obviously a lot of high-performance tires, like the Michelin Pilot Sports, but very, very expensive. For the everyday car, I like to recommend Hankooks, and I think they're a great tire. I usually will suggest a all-season tire, especially being here in Jersey, where we see all sorts of weather. I think that's your best bang. I tell people to try to avoid high performance tires on normal street cars, as they get real blotchy, and a lot of cupping is usually associated with them. Now, if you do choose to use that, just make sure you're rotating the tires and setting the tire pressure, accordingly, obviously with every tire, but more so with big patch tires. Now, if you have an all-season tire, usually the contact points are a lot smaller, so that is usually a little bit more avoided. So I will definitely stay away from anything that's either Live Long or Never Wears or Lionhearts, or there's some like crazy names out there. Now, obviously, those tires are a lot more affordable. And if you use a lot of, if you do a lot of driving and you're going through tires a lot, I can understand why you would choose a lot more cost-efficient tires. Just normally they, contribute to a lot more road noise, or the runouts a lot higher and could cause some unwanted vibrations. So just to recap, my favorite overall price, performance, anything like that, I like the Hancooks. I would stay away from the cheaper stuff personally. And if you like the higher brand stuff or the high performance stuff, that's great. But obviously everything comes at a price or performance, issue at that point. So you really got to pick and choose what you want and what's best for you. Obviously on my TLX, I have a Michelin, but on my Pilot that, obviously we use for longer trips and stuff, I went with the Hankook, which again, I am a fan of. So hopefully that answers the question for you. Okay, so this next question is what to look out for in used cars. Now, the question was specific to a 16 to 17 Pilot 9AT. So some of the things to look out for that car are obviously, or any car like that would be to make sure that if you're in the market for one, that the monitors are set, because if they aren't, either the battery died or somebody cleared a light and just trying to have some funny business going on, could have some sort of a check engine light or a transmission light or something along those lines, and they're trying to hide that fact. Now, I know a lot of people don't like the ZF9 transmission. I personally don't see anything wrong with it. We have tons and tons of failures with the 6AT, and people will argue with me all the time that the 6AT transmission is so much more better than the ZF9, but there's plenty of service bulletins for the 6AT and literally no bulletins for the ZF9, with the exception of the 16 to 17 of the coolers failing and causing some issues, but those were very, very, very early on. And personally, we had one in our shop, so a very small number of issues. Obviously, we're seeing a lot of injector issues, but there's a couple bulletins for that, and warranty extensions, if I'm not mistaken. And these were pre-FACRA issues, so that is one good thing over a 16 to 18 versus a 19 to 21 model a year. So anytime you're buying a used car, and this applies to any car, you're gonna wanna check fenders, quarter panels, stuff like that inside the door. Make sure there's no overspray. I know people rely a lot on Carfax, but a lot of times that doesn't tell the whole story, because Carfax is only going to only know what is reported to the police department or to some sort of a bureau or something like that, a dealer or, some sort of facility. So, if it's not reported to them, then it's not going to show up on a Carfax. So kind of a double-edged sword, but if you take a Honda technician or Toyota technician or whatever applies to that vehicle, or just an overall good tech, then they're going to know what to look for. Obviously, there's noises and stuff to look for, but those are pretty easy to pinpoint. So the trained eye will be able to tell, maybe if the engine was out or the transmission was out already, or some sort of bigger issue that may have occurred in the car's life. So just some of the things that you should look out for. 16, 17, 18 Pilot, I would definitely get, especially in the ZF9. And if they have, obviously maintenance records, that's obviously some positive bonus points for that vehicle. Or if you could buy it from a dealer versus one of those smaller lots. Usually those smaller lots will try to hide a lot of things that big dealers won't, or that the small lot will. But typically that's the general consensus that I see, is the bigger dealers are usually a safer buy, and if there's an issue with the car, it's easier to resolve, versus a smaller lot that obviously is going to try and hide more stuff, try to make a bigger profit margin, or just get rid of the vehicle because it was a bad deal. And it's just going to be harder to fight if they, you run across some issues that weren't disclosed prior to the sale. So hopefully that answers the question for you. All right, so last question of the week, and this is a common suspension issues on Honda vehicles. I think it's specific to 8th or 9th gen Accords, but this will cover mostly anything that we talk about. But before that, make sure you do drop a comment down below. Like that, I'll try to answer any of your questions in next week's video or make a dedicated video to that. So getting to the question, common issues with suspension, not many. To be honest, Honda suspension is typically good, especially once you get to the back of the vehicle. Struts, shocks, they don't really wear out. If you get into a higher mileage vehicle, they could get worn. Very, very rarely do we see a leak in shock or a strut, which is great. We do see some stabilizer links and stabilizer bushings fail. Very simple and very affordable to repair, so not a big deal. If you happen to have a 10th generation Civic Accord or that same year CRV, I believe they're 5th generation CRVs, the tabs on the toe adjustments, they do bend real easy. Again, not a deal breaker if they're bent. You can usually manipulate it with a pry bar, and once you lock into the place, they usually do not move out of place, but it's something that we do see fairly often, especially if the vehicle was in a small accident. Obviously, if it's a big accident, then you're going to have some major damage and a lot of components will need to be replaced. But overall, once it gets to the back of Hondas, without the exception of maybe an occasional shock or two leaking and stabilizer links and bushings, then overall they are super, super sound. If you get to the front end of the vehicle, there's a lot more stuff going on, so obviously a lot more wear on that aspect. But as far as the rear of the vehicle, typically we barely do any work back there, so it's a good thing, right? Because the less stuff you're touching on a consistent basis, the better it is for the consumer. So hopefully that answers the question for you, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.